there's these two competing spheres of power. And unfortunately, the authoritarian communist model of China is rapidly growing. And if they ever take over Taiwan, that will be a disaster.
I think that'll happen under Joe Biden. Do you think so?
Well, so then we should be talking about like Kirk Campbell and Jake Sullivan, like people who might be working for the Biden administration, some of the things they've said. And it does seem...
What are some examples? Who are these people?
Okay, so Jake Sullivan was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. Biden wants him as the National Security Advisor. And he talked about how he considers China's rise like one of his great successes. He was working for that. And he and Kirk Campbell, penned an editorial in Foreign Affairs where they talk about, keeping the status quo with Taiwan, for instance. And China has promised to invade Taiwan.
Yeah. They're doing beaching drills.
Yeah, and they normally, like every year, there's like this message about peaceful reunification. They removed peaceful this year.
Violent reunification.
So what happens when the status quo is changed by the Chinese Communist Party invading Taiwan? What are they going to say about that? Kirk Campbell was also behind one of the biggest foreign policy failures of the U.S. since like the fall of Saigon with the Scarborough Shoal incident
in 2012.
What was that?
So the Scarborough Shoal, we actually went there. We'll see. We can tell that story later. It's like this reef kind of near the Philippines. It's very important to local Filipino fishermen.
It's in the South China Sea, and originally it was kind of a place where Filipino fishermen, Vietnamese fishermen, Chinese fishermen, they could all go and fish in the place. Mm-hmm. It was claimed by several different countries, including the Philippines and China.
Yeah. But then in 2012, China sends in its Coast Guard and basically occupies the shoal. Kirk Campbell leads the U.S. delegation because the Philippines are a treaty ally with the U.S.
We have a mutual defense pact with them, so this might trigger that, right? That they came in
if they come to blows. It looked like they were going to come to blows.
Whoa.
And so they work out this deal where, the Chinese will leave and the Philippine side will leave, and that'll be fine. Well, the Philippine forces leave. The Chinese forces stay.
Yeah, sounds
and
about
the U.S. did nothing.
Under Trump?
No, this was 2012 under Obama.
Oh, that's right. Wow.
And this sent shockwaves throughout the Asia Pacific because suddenly this was like all of these other countries realizing if the U.S. will turn its back on a mutual defense ally, what's going to happen to us? So Thailand began moving closer to the Chinese Communist Party, Philippines, South Korea. We also lost South Korea when we were putting in the THAAD missile defense system. And China freaked out about that and began a huge economic warfare against South Korea. No support from the U.S.
We were both, Luke and I were in South Korea, and there were people protesting the THAAD defense system.
Yeah.
It was controversial within South Korea.
That is true. Yeah. That is definitely true. But so this was like devastating for the image of the U.S. All throughout the Asia Pacific.
That was Obama.
That was under Obama. And specifically, this agreement was negotiated by
For a guy
Kirk
who
Campbell.
loved war. You think he'd have done something.
Supposedly somebody said, we're not going to go to war over a bunch of rocks.
Was that Kirk?
It might have been
I think
Kirk
it was
Campbell.
him who said
That's
that.
insane.
So, but like the wider geopolitical effect it had
disastrous for the U.S.
It was terrible, and it allowed China to basically have free reign within the South China Sea.
In general, I don't think they were prepared for that. I think that totally rewrote their timeline of what they could do things. Because after that, that's when you see them really building up artificial islands and militarizing
these atolls, right? They've like these reefs and stuff.
And now they have like missiles on them.
Yeah, and when the U.S. says, "Hey, don't build those missiles," what do you think China's going to do?
Well, do you remember recently when they did the Elephant March? I think it's called in Guam.
Elephant March.
Yeah, so when the strike group from China went through that strait between Taiwan and what's it called?
The Taiwan Strait.
Strait, I guess. Trump had deployed bombers and heavy military forces to an airbase in Guam, and then they did, I guess it was called like an elephant walk or something, where you see all of these war, planes going, around, showing them, look what we got ready to go. Mm-hmm. And then we retreated because the U.S. military found out that China has weapons capable of wiping out the entire airbase before those planes can get off the ground. So we were forced to pull back and retreat.
Well, that also reminds me of that the Chinese Navy has more ships than the U.S. now, which are not necessarily the same equivalent in terms of technical capability.
Yeah.
But the U.S. military has just been so focused on the sandbox.
Yeah.
And not on China.
I'll tell you, not that it's a one-for-one comparison or a comparison at all, but I think most people who play strategy games know the power of a wave of small troops versus one powerful unit. So we often hear from the U.S. Gun control advocates when they say, well, you think you're going to go to war against the American government? They have cruise missiles. And the typical response is, if you think, if that's what you think, you need to look up the history of Vietnam and Afghanistan. A handful of people with weapons is going to outdo, it's going to easily, I'll put it this way. Fighter jets can't occupy street corners. So there is something to be said for China having more ships, even if they're not nearly as capable. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you guys are experts on, World War II and Russia, but I was reading about how Russia mass-produced really low-quality tanks that were getting blown up like crazy by the Nazis, but they just had so many. They just can't wave after wave of our own men.
That was kind of the AK strategy, right?
The what strategy?
The AK-47. Just like a cheap, easy, simple gun versus like the M6 that had all kinds of issues. The AK-47 you could bury in the mud and still use it.
Make something that is cheap but easy to produce and fast. And then, sure, the Nazis were able to blow up these Russian tanks, but they just kept sending wave after wave because they could just keep making them.
Well, that's Zap Brannigan's strategy.
Exactly. Yes. Wave after wave of our own men until they run out of bullets.
We have to understand, when we look at China's strategy now, it's pretty brilliant. I mean, historically, China hasn't been that strong because of its geopolitical location. But if they're able to offset the fight on islands, especially along very important trade routes, they're implementing a similar policy like the Japanese did during World War II. They don't want the fight in Tokyo. They want the fight in the Pacific. So this is the first beginning of this Chinese expansion, which they need because essentially they're landlocked, and they're landlocked in not a strong position. When you look at their natural resources, they're not doing that well. As you said, they just imported a whole bunch of grain because it's very hard for the Chinese government and the Chinese country to produce for itself. This is why they're also trying to expand their territory in the Himalayas against the troops in India. So we're seeing if China really wants to dominate the world, they're going to have a bunch of islands along these trade routes. And if you look at world wars, they always start along trade routes. So this is very key, and one of the reasons why they're building so many of these strategic locations that they're expanding in. So we have to keep attention to that.
$5 trillion of shipping goes through the South China Sea.
Yes. And so they need that seaport control.
Yes.
That's why it's so important to them. And the reason why they're putting the Uyghur Muslims in these camps is because they need total social control. People who adhere to a religion have a higher power. They need to be the power. Weren't they replacing religious images with like Chairman Mao recently?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's been going on for a while.
Yeah.
Well, Mao, Xi and Mao both.
It's the same strategy they've actually been using all throughout the 70 years of the Chinese Communist Party's history. Like everything that's happening in Xinjiang now, to a lesser extent, they did to the Falun Gong practitioners before that. And we were just talking to somebody from southern Mongolia.
Which is Inner
Mongolia. Yeah. They did a same wave of genocide in Mongolia that people don't really hear about. They did it in Tibet. These are all the same things, just the same strategy, just being refined and refined. And we just don't stop.
I'll tell you something crazy. There was a period where, I'll just say someone that I know very well was a YouTuber, and they got an email one day from someone who asked them to upload a video to their YouTube channel. Not to run an ad, not to do a promo, to straight, hey, would you be willing to upload a video to your channel in exchange for $200? The video was some guy in New York talking about Falun Gong and how backwards it was, but it was a really interesting bit of propaganda where the person wasn't saying Falun Gong is bad. They were like, it's so strange that we allow this weird cult-like religion in our country. Why would we do this? We have these people and they're dangerous, and it was like I said, don't upload that, don't take the money, but people did. So they found channels that were small to mid-size, maybe 10, 20,000 subscribers or more, would just be like, wow, a couple $100, I need the money, and they would upload this propaganda piece from China.
Wow.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
It's amazing, like all the little pieces of propaganda that are able to filter into the
Yeah.
U.S.
Can you guys explain some of the larger propaganda efforts that are utilized in China? I know there's a crackdown on religions, but I also have seen videos of people rebelling and fighting against the Chinese government as well. Is there anything legitimately going on, or is the propaganda so strong with the social credit score that there isn't any resistance at all?
Oh, okay. Here's an interesting story that kind of ties into that. Though it might seem tangential. There was a story this past year of a Chinese student who was studying in the U.S. He made a post to Twitter in the U.S. comparing Chinese Chairman Xi Jinping to the villain from Biker Mice from Mars.
Okay.
And then he goes back to China and is arrested for that. So the first and biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party's actions are always the Chinese people themselves.
Yeah.
Now I think you should tell the story about Chenguangcheng, what he told you.
Oh yeah, Chenguangcheng is a blind Chinese human rights activist.
He's the daredevil.
He's the he was
daredevil.
he was a barefoot lawyer in China, and he was arrested for basically trying to help women who had forced abortions because of the one-child policy, and he was just trying to help them get some kind of like legal redress. And
China is anti-choice and anti-life.
yeah,
Yeah, interesting.
both. And then he was put in prison for years for traffic violations.
Wow.
And then he was put under house arrest for many years too, but he managed to escape house arrest and make his way to Beijing. We had activists helping him, and he made it to the U.S. Embassy
Wow.
back in 2012, and the U.S. ended up granting him asylum.
Oh, wow.
So we interviewed him last year, and he was talking about how, it looks from the surface to a lot of people like the Chinese people as a whole support the Chinese Communist Party, especially because a lot of the Chinese nationals that you'll meet in places like the U.S., they're rich. And they're rich because their families have some connection to the party, or their families are party members. Like, they have some kind of wealth that's tied back to the Communist Party. So, and also all the young people have been kind of brainwashed to be very nationalistic. So they'll be very supportive of the Chinese Communist Party, but that's not the real case on the ground. But you can't know that, because even on the internet, Chinese people are very careful about what they say, because they know that you're going to get sent to prison for, saying the wrong thing on WeChat or whatever. So they won't say it online.
And there are videos I've seen where, somebody might be filming in China, and then they ask a question, the person will like go under their breath and be like, no, I can't talk about this.
Yeah. And so he was saying that there are so many people who are against the Chinese Communist Party, but it is hard unless you have the connections inside China to know that they're there.
I want to point something out real quick too, because there's a stereotype about Chinese people being really bad drivers, right? You've probably heard it.
Yes.
Family Guy has a joke where, just the other day we were watching Family Guy, and it's a Chinese woman, and she's like, how long do I need to signal to change 8 lanes? And then she just crashes the car or whatever. But I was talking to this guy I know who spent a lot of time, a lot of his life in China, and he said what people don't realize, the Chinese who can make it to the United States tend to be wealthier than those who stay in China.
It's only possible.
And many of these people have their own drivers their whole lives in China. They come here and they're not drivers. They're the wealthier people, so now they have to drive themselves. And so it's a class issue of where you end up seeing these stereotypically bad drivers. Not to say that it's legitimately true that, every person is bad at driving, but he pointed out, you don't realize these are the wealthy people who are coming here. And that's why that stereotype, ends up coming about.
I mean, in China, people are notoriously bad drivers, but that's also because they've only been driving since like the early 2000s, really.
Oh, wow.
Most
it wasn't
people,
long ago with bicycles.
Yeah, so most people had not been driving that long. So there's a lot of the kind of traffic etiquette that the kind of stuff that's not necessarily a law, but people learn. You're going to let people into the lane if they need to merge or whatever. That stuff doesn't exist.
Right.
That kind of culture, because they haven't been driving that long.
It's pretty easy to just find horrific videos of like someone crossing the street and then just at 100 miles an hour, boom, run over by you. There's a lot of those videos.
There's a huge emerging middle class in China, which is looking like it's going to be a problem for the larger government. It's very interesting to see how they're going to address that problem. But very interestingly, when you talked about the one-child policy, I automatically thought about many American elites a lot of specialized high-level individuals like Ted Turner that are fans of the one-child policy and have complimented it before on the American stage as well. So it is interesting to see the kind of ties to a lot of these individuals. I actually talked to Ted Turner and I asked him, if you believe in the one-child policy as much as you do and as much as you advocate for it, why do you have 4 children? He didn't like that question. But again,
well, it rules for thee, but not for me. Come
of
on.
course, yeah, that's how it is.
I mean,
some animals are more
equal than others. Even the one-child policy, the one-child policy was a failure.
Absolutely.
And the Chinese government kind of knows it, but they can't say it.
Because they can't admit they made a mistake.
Yeah, so that's why there's now a 2-child policy instead of a 1-child policy, because they realize they screwed themselves with the population control.
And just a big picture for a moment, the Chinese Communist Party has concentration camps, harvests organs, and for many years it was illegal to have a brother or a sister.
Wow.
Well, there were some, like,
In
this
the
is
rule.
Yeah,
Is it
like,
area?
the thing with Chinese law or policy is that, like, it's a very unevenly actually, it's kind of like they have like a decree from up top and then like it's up to the local officials to implement it, and they do it very unevenly depending on where you are. So if you're in like a wealthier area, maybe you just have to pay a fine and you can afford it to have another kid. In the rural areas, like, that's like, the more disadvantaged you are, like, the more likely that it's going to be like you get hauled into a van for a forced abortion or something like that.
Jeez.
Because they have to make an example out of you. And also, the terrible thing was that a lot of these family planning policies, like the one-child policy, they were a way for local governments to make money. So if they couldn't fine you, then they would make an example out of you. And that even, like, you know, in the 90s, a lot of people were starting to adopt Chinese girls, like in the U.S. and other places, because they were like, oh, well, girls aren't wanted, so, you know, we're going to adopt them.
Now there's 30 million more men.
Well,
right, so that's what I wanted to ask, right? Didn't they create this imbalance where there's not enough women for the men now?
They did, but also there was like something that weird that happened where there became a black market for Chinese baby girls to sell to be adopted in the U.S.
What?
Because, like, they would, like, let's say you had a second child and it was a girl and you didn't want to give the kid up, they could take the kid from you and put it in an orphanage, and the local government could be like, this baby was abandoned. Mm-hmm. And then, so you had cases of, like, families where, like, their kid was literally taken from them, and then, you know, the adoptive parents, like, usually pay hundreds or maybe a couple $1,000s to the local government for the adoption. So the local government is making money off of, like, stealing kids and selling them to be adopted to the U.S.
So cool. And sex trafficking is such a huge issue. Like, I know the Trump administration sanctioned, or not sanctioned, but like called out China for human trafficking. But yeah, that's a big way they're dealing with this gender imbalance.
Yes. Sex trafficking came from
lots
Myanmar,
of
from North Korea, you know, from, like,
Our show, it's got lots of funny humor. It's fun to watch.
Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. We do the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., so come back to check us out when we go live. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and we are also available on all podcast platforms for free if you want to listen to us there. Thanks for hanging out, and we will see you all next time.